My teacher is essentially trying to punish me for having a meltdown. Not only that, but she humiliated me in front of the whole class too. What action could I take to prevent this happening again? I knew it would happen at some point. There's always that one lesson, that one situation at school when everything gets out of hand. But I didn't think it would be like this, with that one teacher, that I would be humiliated like this. It was a normal day. The last lesson was an EPQ, a subject where you would think you could work on your project in peace, without pressure and without constant quizzes. I came in with a slight feeling of anxiety, but nothing special. I knew I was tired. It had been a tough week, lots of homework, sleepless nights, and I always have background anxiety. I never know when a meltdown might hit. Sometimes it's just because of loud noises. Sometimes it's because of the feeling of being driven into a corner. And I try to avoid it, but it doesn't always work. The EPQ teacher is new to me. I had never had a class with her before. I knew that she had been told about my peculiarity at school, but it seems that either she decided to ignore it or decided that it is necessary to temper the character. But tempering is one thing, and destroying from within is quite another. From the very beginning, she acted strangely around me. She constantly invaded my personal space, leaned too close, caught my eye, waited for me to talk. She didn't do that with other guys, and that day it all started with that. She came up to me, literally hung over me and stared straight into my eyes. The seconds seemed like an eternity. I didn't know what to say, didn't know what she was waiting for. Panic began to grow inside me. My heart sped up. I squeezed out some uncertain, yeah, I'm working. And she just chuckled slightly and walked on. But I was already feeling bad. When such a trigger is launched, it is difficult to stop it. I felt how everything inside was shaking, and I understood that if I did not leave, there would be a meltdown right in the middle of the class. I gathered my strength and said that I wanted to go to silent study, but it was almost impossible to explain this clearly. The words were confused, the voice was shaking. She didn't just not help. She decided to turn everything into a performance. She raised her eyebrows, made a theatrical movement with her hands as if to say, "Come on, explain," and said loudly for the whole class to hear, "Well, we're all listening, what happened?" I froze. The guys stared at me. I tried to explain that I needed to leave, that I didn't feel well, but my words came out choppy. I stuttered, my voice broke, and she stood opposite, grinning and seeming to enjoy the moment. "You look pale," she said loudly so that the neighboring tables laughed. "Maybe it's a drama?" The class giggled quietly. I felt a lump in my throat. At that moment, my body betrayed me. My hands started shaking, tears welled up in my eyes. I realized that everyone was watching, and that made it even worse. I stood up to leave, but she didn't let go. "Stop. First, tell me where you're going. We can't just run around the school like that." The seconds seemed like an eternity. I barely squeezed out. In silent study, she made a dramatic gesture with her shoulders as if ridiculing my condition. "Okay, if it's absolutely necessary." I walked out shaking all over. I broke down outside the door. I didn't even have time to reach the study room before tears were already flowing. Only one thing was pounding in my head. Why? Why like this? Why did you have to parade me in front of the whole class? Why couldn't you just let me go? When I got to silent study and closed the door behind me, I collapsed at the nearest table and burst into tears. A real meltdown, with all the symptoms. Shaking, tears, inability to connect thoughts. I knew the lesson was no longer meaningful to me. All I could do was sit and wait for the day to end. And as I sat there, I thought, she wasn't even trying to help. She knew I had a diagnosis. She knew I needed space sometimes. But instead, she chose to humiliate me in public. When the bell rang, I was still sitting in silent study. Time seemed to dissolve. I didn't notice how the whole lesson had passed. My eyes were swollen, my head was buzzing. I was afraid to go out into the hallway because I knew that someone from the class would definitely be there. And they all saw how I trembled and stuttered in front of the teacher. I waited about 5 minutes for the building to empty a bit and only then decided to go out. I tried not to meet anyone's eyes, walked quickly down the corridor and went outside. My steps echoed in my head. It seemed that every person who looked at me knew what had happened. At home, I collapsed right on the sofa. Mom immediately noticed that something was wrong. My eyes were red. My breathing was ragged. I couldn't stand it and told her everything. About how she hung over me, how she made me talk to the whole class, how she joked when I could barely hold on to not cry. Mom listened silently, but as I spoke, her face darkened. I rarely saw her like this. Usually she is calm, gentle, but this time real anger lit up her eyes. "It's humiliating," she said when I finished. "She had no right to do this to you, especially knowing about your diagnosis." I just nodded. It was empty inside. The tears were gone, only tiredness remained. A couple of hours later, my mother came into my room with a firm expression on her face. "We're going to take action," she said. "This can't happen again." At first I was scared. At school I always tried to be inconspicuous, not to cause problems, not to attract attention to myself. But now there was too much attention. And I understood. If I kept quiet, this teacher would do the same thing again, either to me or to someone else. Mom suggested meeting with the head teacher and the principal. Make a list of what happened and report it officially. She even said the word discrimination. That's discrimination, Mom said. She made fun of you, ignored your request, and then tried to accuse you of skipping school. That can't be hushed up. I listened to her, and for the first time that day, I felt some kind of strength coming into me. Yes, I was still scared. Yes, I was afraid that if we started making noise, everything would only get worse. But I also knew that my mother was right. That evening, I got a text from a friend. She wrote, "Listen, your teacher asked the others where you were. She said you were skipping class." I stared at the screen, and everything inside me went cold. So not only did she humiliate me in front of everyone, but she was also trying to make me out to be a liar and a troublemaker. And I left officially. I told her where I was going, and the cameras would confirm it. "Here's the proof," Mom said when I showed her the correspondence. "We have to look into it." At that moment, I decided, yes, we will fight. But inside, there was still fear. I remembered standing in the middle of the class, how she laughed, how the kids giggled. That moment played over and over in my head, like a broken record. I understood that even if the teacher was punished, that scene would not go away. It would remain inside me. The next day, Mom insisted that we go to school together. She had written a letter to the administration in advance and asked for an official meeting with the head teacher. I was all cringing inside. I was afraid that everything would go sideways, that the teacher would put even more pressure on me, but Mom assured me, "You have the right to safe conditions. No one should humiliate you." When we entered the office, the head teacher and my year's supervisor were already waiting there. Both looked tense, as if they knew what the conversation would be about. Mom started speaking calmly but firmly. She listed everything: how the teacher hovered over me, how she laughed when I stuttered, how she made me stand in front of the whole class, and how after that, she went on to spread rumors about skipping school. "My daughter has a diagnosis," the mother said. "You are obliged to take her characteristics into account. Instead of support, she received public humiliation and accusations. This is discrimination based on disability." The head teacher fidgeted. "We'll sort this out, of course. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding." I listened and felt my insides seethe. A misunderstanding? How could it be called a misunderstanding that the whole class laughed while I stood there shaking? I gathered my courage and spoke up myself. My voice was shaking, but I still said, "I told her I was going to silent study. I didn't leave school, I didn't hide. The cameras will confirm it." But she still told the others I was skipping. "It's a lie." The curator nodded. "We'll look at the footage from the cameras," she said, "and talk to the teacher." Mom didn't give in. "We need a guarantee that this won't happen again. My daughter has the right to be treated with respect. I want the school to train the staff on how to properly work with children with special needs." The head teacher looked at her as if she was demanding the impossible, but she still wrote something down in her notebook. After the meeting, I left the office feeling like a weight had been lifted off me. Yes, nothing had been decided yet. Yes, the teacher would probably be unhappy. But for the first time, I felt like I had a voice. On the way home, Mom said, "Did you see their faces? They know they made a mistake. Now you'll have allies." I didn't know if I could trust them, but I knew for sure I would never again allow anyone to call my breakdown truancy or laugh at me when I was barely hanging on. The next day, I came to the EPQ feeling like I was walking on thin ice. The room was unusually quiet. The kids were whispering, but not as openly as before. Some were looking at me sideways. Some were pretending that nothing had happened. I sat closer to the exit. I felt calmer that way. I put water, a notebook, and a pre-printed note for the teachers on the table. If I ask to leave, it is not a truancy. This is part of my reasonable conditions. I will return after the regulation. Mom insisted that I send the same note by email to the head teacher and the curator, and they confirmed receipt. The teacher came in later than everyone else, silently with a folder in her hands. Our eyes met for a second, and she immediately looked away. Neither the usual looming nor the long drilling of her gaze. She kept her distance. She noted those present and began the lesson in an even voice, as if nothing had happened between us. This made it even more disturbing. The silence could have been a truce, or it could have been preparation for a countermove. About 10 minutes later, the door opened and the head teacher appeared in the classroom. She sat down at the last desk and took out a notepad. The teacher visibly tensed up but continued. I was working on the project plan and diligently breathing in the rhythm of 4 inhales, 6 exhales. When the noise in the classroom grew, I raised my hand and calmly said, "I need to go to silent study for 10 minutes. I'll be right back." The teacher nodded briefly without comment. The head teacher looked up and nodded almost imperceptibly. I left. In the hallway, for the first time, I felt that this phrase sounded like a normal part of the educational process, and not drama. I sat in silent study for 6 minutes, drank some water, noted in my head, "The alarm is currently at a 3 out of 10, and returned. No comments, no giggles. Dylan from the parallel class moved next to me. He whispered, If you want, I can be your buddy and walk with you when you need to. I nodded, a small thing, but it made me feel warmer inside. After the lesson, I was asked to go to the supervisor's office. She and the head teacher were there. They reported the results of the investigation. The camera footage confirmed that I had gone into silent study and had not left the building for the rest of the day. The employee who had seen me in the room confirmed it. The wording truanting was officially recognized as unfounded. There was a printed document on the table, a plan for reasonable conditions for me, with the points that my mother and I had asked for: distance and personal boundaries, no bending over or hovering, no prolonged direct eye contact, communication. Questions are asked one at a time, without the requirement to answer in front of the whole class. A short written note is allowed instead of an oral answer. Silent timeout, the right to go into silent study for 10 to 15 minutes without publicly explaining the reasons. Reporting to the duty officer and returning is mandatory. Seating, exit seat, noise-canceling headphones permitted. Feedback, comments, in a low stimulation tone, separately without sarcasm. Contacts, all incidents, through the curator/SENCO. No rumors or retellings in collegial chats. The supervisor said quietly, "We will conduct a short training session for the staff with the SENCO on how to deal with anxiety and meltdown. The teacher has been instructed to comply with the plan. This is not a punishment, it is a support standard. But if there are any violations, we will act according to the procedure." I listened and felt the lump in my throat go away. Not everything was perfect, but for the first time it felt like a system, not just be patient. In the hallway, my classmate Lizzie caught up with me. "Sorry for that laugh. We were confused. It was ugly." I nodded. Sometimes a simple sorry fixes more than long speeches. By lunchtime, the rumors had settled. Some whispered that the teacher got a reprimand, others that the admin is watching. I tried not to get involved. The main thing was that I now had a paper shield, a plan signed by the school. During the next EPQ, the head teacher came to the class again, this time without a notepad, just sat at the back. The teacher was as polite as possible. Walking past my desk, she stopped for a second. "If you need a room, just raise your hand," she said evenly without a hint of irony. "Thank you," I replied. Such a simple word, and how many times had I not heard it before? Of course, there was no ideal friendship between us. During a group discussion, she habitually tried to prick someone's vague formulation, and then immediately caught herself, changing her tone to a soft one. I noticed how the head teacher marked it with a tick. It looks like the observation will continue. In the evening, my mother asked, "How did it go?" Calmly, I said, and for the first time in many days, I didn't add but, just calmly. I was still afraid of a relapse, but with the fear came the understanding that now I not only had rights, but also mechanisms and people. Mom, a curator, a SENCO, that very Dylan buddy, Lizzie with her sorry. Sometimes a small network of supports is enough for safety. Before going to bed, I jotted down rules for my own safety in a notebook, simple as road signs. I noticed an increase in anxiety, water breathing timeout, an awkward question. You can write it down, a public challenge. I'll answer in writing later. Shame is not a signal of danger, but a trace of embarrassment. On the last line, I wrote, "My dignity is not a topic for jokes." And suddenly I caught myself thinking about tomorrow for the first time, without the usual what if. If there is an if, I have a plan, and that means the ice under my feet has become thicker. The first few days after the meeting dragged on like a probationary period. I ticked off little safety markers, as if I were keeping a checklist inside my head. The door remained unlocked. The seat by the exit was mine. On the table was water and a card with the phrase, "You need to go to silent study. I'll be back in 10 to 15 minutes." The teacher kept her distance, as if a thin, light line had appeared around me that she didn't touch. The SENCO arrived midweek, officially to observe EPQ practice, unofficially, a short briefing to the whole class on how to support those feeling overwhelmed. Nothing personal, no names, no finger pointing. If someone asks for time silence, it's not a whim. It's a way of getting back into working mode. The children listened surprisingly attentively. After the session, the Senko came up to me at the door and asked in a whisper, "Okay, what if we add a quiet corner to the room?" A couple of chairs, a screen. I nodded. 2 days later, there was a screen and 2 gray bean bags in the corner. Earplugs and breathing cards, 4 to 6 on the table. The teacher tried to speak evenly. Sometimes old intonations would break through. A sharp laugh, a drawn-out "well," and she would suppress them, as if remembering. Once at the board, she asked me to say the structure of my project out loud for everyone to hear. I felt a degree jump inside me, from 3 to 5 on my scale. I picked up the card. In writing, later. She froze for a second, then nodded. Okay, put it on the table at the end of the lesson. In the evening, I sent her the file. In response, she said, received. The structure is strong briefly without sarcasm. It was unusual and normal. Things got easier with the class, too. Dylan had gotten used to sitting next to me and wordlessly pushing a bottle of water towards me when the noise grew. Lizzie shushed the kids a couple of times when they were talking too loudly. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just a chance, but a participant in a common process. The small network of supports worked better than any posters on the walls. At the end of the second week, I was invited to a short restorative dialogue meeting. In the room, me, the teacher, the facilitator, not a formal apology, but something close. The teacher said, I understand that it was wrong. I should have let you out, not made you the center of attention. It won't happen again. The voice was harsher than the words, but each won't sounded like a promise, now being looked at by two adult witnesses. I said, it's important to me that questions are not asked in front of the whole class, and that you don't comment on my appearance or voice. She nodded. Okay. The facilitator wrote it down in the plan. There were some minor breakdowns. During one class, another teacher popped into the room, called the teacher out into the hallway, and the noise level instantly spiked. Someone turned on a video on their phone, and laughter rang out. I felt a wave wash over me. My palms were sweaty. My ears were buzzing. I picked up the card, but no one was there to see it. So I just stood up, made the quiet corner sign to Dylan, grabbed some water, and went behind the screen. I sat there counting my breaths, clutching a cold spring in my palm. I returned 7 minutes later, just as the teacher had returned to the classroom. No one said anything, and that silence wasn't a punishment, it was an admission. That's how it's supposed to work. Somewhere around the third week, I received a letter from the head teacher. The equality policy has been updated. We have included a block on reasonable conditions and staff training. Thank you for your constructive suggestions. I reread the phrase, thank you, several times. Strangely, it took away some of the shame. It turns out that you can not only ask, but also change the rules. The rumors were dying down. One boy whispered during recess, what is it so hard to just answer? And then Lizzie said calmly, it's hard not to answer when you're being publicly exposed. He looked embarrassed and looked away. I didn't add anything. Enough had already been said for me. Mom and I introduced a week of decompression. One evening without lessons, just a shower, pajamas, a TV series with subtitles, a cat on your lap. Senko sent a little reminder. Anticipation of overload is half the battle. I set a reminder on my phone. Every 2 lessons, water 2 minutes by the window. It sounds funny, but these pauses work like safety knots on a rope. The most tense moment happened when the teacher, as usual, came too close. Her hand rested on the back of my chair. My muscles clenched involuntarily. I looked up and simply said, please distance. She pulled her hand back instantly, quietly. Sorry. The curator was sitting at the back of the class. It seemed they were really on course. Gradually, new rituals began to appear in the lessons. At the beginning, there was the noise meter. If the class got above the conditional A, the teacher asked everyone to be silent for a minute and catch their breath. Not only for my sake, it turned out that this was useful for many. At the end, there was the exit ticket. You could hand in your answers in writing and leave without speaking. Since then, I have never left with a lump in my throat. The most important thing was something else. I stopped waiting for the blow. Yes, anxiety returned, like the shadow of a lamp in the evening, but it could be touched with rules, outlined with boundaries, called by name. I learned to notice the first signs of overload and to act before the body took control. This did not make me less me. On the contrary, it brought me together. One day after class, the teacher lingered by my desk. Your project is going well. I'm glad we found a format for working, she said, slightly stretching out her words, like someone learning in a new way. Me too, I replied, and unexpectedly for myself, I added, thank you for the screen. She nodded. Maybe it was really hard for her to admit her mistake. Maybe she was just being reminded of the rules. What difference did it really make, as long as I had room in the office to breathe? In my diary, I put a check mark next to the line, prevent a repeat, and wrote, not heroism, but a system. Because it is impossible to maintain borders alone, you need a network, paper, people, and simple, almost everyday solutions. Security is built from them. The most nerve-wracking week was the week before the EPQ midterms. An external moderator was to come to the class, a larger-than-usual auditorium, a projector, a timer, questions from the floor. Everything I usually bypassed would converge. The Senko had suggested a plan in advance. Reasonable accommodations apply to public formats, too. We agreed on options: a seat by the exit, a quiet corner, the right to replace a verbal answer with a short note, water on the table, the pause gesture, and if necessary, moving to the end of the list. On the day of the presentations, the office sounded different. New voices, rustling papers, foreign perfumes. I arrived early, touched the chair behind the screen. It became like an anchor for me. Checked the slide decks. Everything opens. Dylan sat down next to me, quietly tapped the bottle. The water is in place. I smiled. The moderator walked in with a notepad and a friendly speech speed, slightly faster than comfortable. The teacher introduced the format dryly without the usual jokes. I noted it holds up. Lizzie spoke first, then me. The timer clicked. I went to the screen, caught my eye on the upper edge of the wall where there were no faces, and began. My voice trembled but did not break. On the third slide, the projector flickered and went out. The class swayed with noise. Someone gasped. Someone laughed. My heart instantly jumped to 6. Before, I would have frozen. Now, mechanics, a pause gesture towards the teacher. Inhale for 4, exhale for 6. Let's take 2 minutes, the teacher said and turned to the class. Silence, please. Dylan glanced towards the quiet corner. I nodded and went behind the screen, sat down, put my feet on the floor, clutched the cold key in my palm. I heard the SENCO whispering to the technician at the door. Let's check the cable. 3 minutes later, the lights came back on. So did I. The moderator inclined his head. Ready to continue, or do you want to move this to the end? I said, I will continue. And so I did, with printouts in case of another failure. When I finished, the room was quiet. The moderator smiled. Special mention, clever management of the pause. It sounded like a medal for what used to be called drama. Plan B worked with the questions too. On the third clarifying question, I felt that the thought was falling apart and raised the written card. The moderator nodded. I accept answers by mail within 24 hours. No one rolled their eyes. No one giggled. Normal practice, period. After the lesson, we were called for a short debriefing. The teacher said, that moment with the pause, that was right. Thank you for signaling. The Senko added, a good example of how reasonable accommodations help everyone. The pause brought the class together. I walked home with lightness in my feet. It felt like the system had been tested, not on paper, but in living, noisy reality. In the evening, I told my mother the most important thing. I didn't have to explain my right to a pause. It was built in. A couple of days later, a letter came from the administration. Based on the observations, the checklist for public formats has been updated. Pause options, change of order, written responses. Available upon request. Brief training. At the next pedagogical council, I printed out the letter and put it in the folder with the plan. Let it lie nearby, like a second seat belt. To prevent this from happening again, I have developed a specific set of actions for myself. Not slogans, but mechanisms. Record everything in writing. Any incident is a short note. Date, what happened, who saw it. A letter to the curator/SENCO is without emotion, just the facts. Paper is the language that the system understands. Reasonable accommodations plan. Clear points. Distance. Right to a quiet timeout. Exit seat. Headphones. Written response option. Tone. Feedback rules. Signed by school, parent, me. Update if a new trigger or option appears. Allies. A mini network of 2 or 3 people. A class buddy, a SENCO, a mentor. These are the ones you can show the card to if your voice doesn't come out. Staff training. Short briefings without naming names. What is overload? What it looks like in reality. How to react correctly. Pause. Low voice. Offer options. What not to do. Sarcasm, public challenge. No public shaming. No. Explain to the whole class why you need to leave. The marker is a simple phrase. I'll be back in 10 to 15 minutes. Any questions after, one-on-one or in writing. Monitoring and feedback. Periodic short meetings. What worked/what to improve. Don't wait for a crisis to fix. Alternatives in public formats. Written answers, changing the queue. Printouts in case of equipment. Right to pause. Agree in advance, so as not to prove the obvious at moment X. Self-regulation as a skill. Water, breathing, a quiet corner, an anchor, a key, a pebble. Reminders pauses in the schedule. This is not a whim, but a rescue kit. Don't argue with "it's a joke" to the phrase "relax." A ready-made response formula. I don't like this. Please don't do this. If it repeats, points 1 and 2. If necessary, escalate. If the instructions are violated, follow the procedure. Curator to head teacher to administration. Without shouting, but consistently. When I entered the classroom again, I caught myself thinking a simple thing. I don't have to earn the right to respect every time from scratch. We built the rails once, and now we can ride on them. Yes, I'll have to monitor, file new points, remind. But this is no longer about surviving alone, but about the work of the system. During the last double lesson, the teacher passing by said neutrally, "Your draft of the chapter looks convincing. If you want, we can discuss it in writing. Will it be more convenient for you?" "Yes," I answered. "Writing will do." And we really discussed it, without a scene, without tell it to the whole class. Before going to bed, I opened my journal and wrote, "It's not my fault I need a break, and I don't have to explain my value to people who joke." I put a check mark next to it. Stress test passed. For the first time in months, I felt not only protected, but also growing. And that's probably the best answer to the question of what steps to take to prevent this from happening again. The ones that turn a one-time fight into a sustainable practice with paper, allies, and the right to say pause at the right time.